Welcome to The Deep End by On Deck, a podcast where visionary builders, creators, and experts discuss world-changing ideas. I'm your host, Marshall Kosloff. Let's dive in. With The Deep End, we're creating a space where we skip the surface level and go in-depth into ideas that matter. I'll be your guide as we explore possible futures of commerce, higher education, art, governance, longevity, and more, with some of the most exciting figures in their respective fields.
Like they would run a hemoglobin A1C blood test. Great, like I'm not pre-diabetic. And that was it. And like I have to wonder if that was basically how my grandfather's experience was, is that things were fine until they weren't fine.
Joining me in The Deep End are Andrew Connor and Sam Corcos, co-founders of Levels Health. This is our first ever episode of two simultaneous guests, which is fitting because Sam and Andrew initially met at On Deck's first major event 2 years ago, the Tahoe Founder Retreat. Since that fateful meeting, Sam and Andrew have gone on to co-found Levels together. Their goal is nothing short of changing the way the world interacts with food through the creation of a whole new product category centered around metabolic health. Levels' brilliant product, currently in beta, provides a near-instantaneous feedback loop to let a user know how their body reacts to the various foods and drinks they consume. With this new information, people can better optimize what they eat in order to lose weight, have more energy, and get better sleep. It can also help them reduce the likelihood of developing metabolic health issues like diabetes down the road. Starting from this deep dive into health, we go on to discuss a wide range of topics related to food, politics, science, disease, and what it's like to build a company and a category at the same time. Sam and Andrew are at the absolute cutting edge of what they do, and they're on a mission to change our health trajectories for the better, so you don't want to miss this one. Before we dive in, I wanted to give you a heads up about an incredible live podcast recording session that you can participate in. One of the best things about The Deep End is how brilliant and curious our audience is, and we want to get you more involved in the podcast recording process. In that spirit, we're inviting you to join us on Monday, August 16th, for a discussion with Delian Asparohov, principal at Founders Fund and co-founder of Varda Space Industries, a startup which is building space factories to build products for us to use back here on Earth. Unlike a normal podcast, you'll have the chance to ask Delian any questions you might have, some of which will even be immortalized in the actual published podcast episode. Don't miss the chance to participate. RSVP for free at thedeepend.substack.com. This link will also be in the show notes. The Deep End is produced by On Deck, where top talent goes to accelerate their ideas and careers. We hope that those who listen to the ideas on the show are inspired to build. To learn more about On Deck's programs, visit beondeck.com. For show notes and additional resources related to The Deep End, check out ideas.beondeck.com. All right, let's dive in. Sam Corcos, Andrew Connor, welcome to The Deep End.
Good to be here.
Yeah, good to be here. Thank you.
Let's start here because it's really key to what we're talking about today. What does Levels provide for a consumer who's using the product?
The goal is to help show you how your food affects your body. Nutrition has really been a black box for people for a long time, and the goal is to give some transparency into that. A lot of foods that people think are healthy actually cause a lot of their lifestyle problems. That's really the main goal of the company.
I have to ask the most obvious follow-up question of all time. What is a food that I think is healthy, but is really causing my life to fall apart?
I'm happy to give you my example. So the biggest that blew my mind is I considered Cliff Bars health adjacent. They're obviously sweet.
Don't do this to me, Andrew. Don't do this to me. I like Cliff Bars.
Yeah. So with an active lifestyle, it's something you have while hiking or, between meals or something like that. And for me in particular, I am very, very sensitive to rice. And the major sweetener is rice syrup, plus oats, which for me is metabolic jet fuel. Combine them, the response is like triple carb for carb compared to like something like ice cream. And so, it is more than a candy bar, and something that I previously regarded as health adjacent or health enough. Another one that I think blows a lot of people's minds is alternative milks. It's very easy to take a carb and refine it so that it tastes wonderful and it has a really good mouthfeel. But it's basically, it can be metabolized incredibly quickly. And so like it feels like, nice to be able to reduce your animal impact or, environmental impact or anything like that. So like they have like these halos around them. But we have a lot of data that, some of these alternative milks are pretty metabolically dangerous.
How about you, Sam?
I mean, the biggest one for me is oatmeal and orange juice, which I think it's more the surprise, which is because of how much misinformation I had taken in related to them. Just assuming for the first roughly 30 years of my life that those are the healthiest things that you can do. And then to realize that they were actually the source of a lot of my lifestyle problems, that the midday energy crash was actually, you could measure it in the data and you could see the huge spike followed by the hypoglycemic crash. And I would get shaky hands. I would feel tired. I'd always assumed it was caffeine or lack of sleep or something. It's kind of weird that it never occurred to me that it could be related to what I was eating. I don't know why. I just assumed that a calorie is a calorie, so it doesn't really matter. But the reality is that your body does get affected by these things quite significantly.
I have to be honest with the audience, this episode is particularly devastating because with the exception of the orange juice, I am an active Whole Foods $3 markup consumer of every single one of these products. And I feel very good about myself afterwards. So I think this episode is going to be very revelatory going down the line of all those things. So before we get a little deeper, then I just want to set the stakes then. Sam, you spoke about this a bit with the crashing, the jitters. I'm guessing, though, the stakes are a little higher than that. So let's just understand when we're talking about the way this is making people feel, especially if you're initial consumers. Because what's interesting about this is, and we'll get into this in more detail, but you're taking the, as you referenced, the Tesla model here, as in you're focused on the premium consumer who's health obsessed. I see a Equinox going, Whole Foods eating type of person who could want to pay for the lifestyle bits there. But I feel as if the health problems that are facing the cohort you're describing are different than the, let's say, diabetic or pre-diabetic population that one would typically think of. So let's just establish the stakes here, starting with the premium users who are starting off with your product. Either of you can take that.
Yeah, I can take it first, and we can hand it to Andrew. I think the answer is that the main reason is that it's really expensive right now. Just the hardware itself, it's really expensive, and similar to like the early Tesla product, it was really expensive to build an electric car, and so you can't build a mass market car when it's really expensive. Another aspect to it is that in order to make this something that has consumer appeal, you can't make it a medical product. There's actually a really good book. A lot of my learnings for levels have come from books that I've read that are completely unrelated to what it is we're doing. There's a great book called The Longevity Economy, which is actually about how do you build products and services for an elderly population. And the biggest lesson from that book is don't build products for an elderly population. Nobody who is 80 years old wants to feel like they're 80 years old. They don't want to be demeaned. They don't want to be patronized. And so when you go to your grandparents and you give them this like giant telephone with like 4 buttons on it, and you treat them like a child, they get upset, like reasonably so. They're adults. One of the biggest revelations for that book, or that he mentions for that audience, was the iPhone, because the screen is variable. It's the same people using the same products, but if you're older, you just make the font size bigger, and it doesn't have the stigma. Stigma is a really big part of it. I think of this very similarly, which is we need this to be measuring glucose, measuring health, measuring other biomarkers, we need to normalize this and make it something that reasonable people will do. This is not something that your doctor tells you to do because you're irresponsible. It has to be something that's mainstream first. And then you can work towards different things that are clinical.
Yeah. How about you, Andrew? So when you think of the premium consumer, what are the costs of their lifestyle that you think they should be thinking of that monitoring glucose would really provide an actual real value add for?
Yeah, it's interesting. Several decades ago, it wasn't believed that thin people could develop type 2 diabetes. And we're seeing this clinically more and more. And, both the physicians and the researchers we're working directly with and just in the literature, that people that feel otherwise healthy, that are fueling themselves on garbage diets, don't really have a feedback loop between their food and what's happening physiologically. And so more than just like crashes throughout the day or, potential accountability for losing weight, there's a metabolic health crisis at the end of this. Poor metabolic health and insulin resistance leads to things like you mentioned, diabetes, but also heart disease, erectile dysfunction, PCOS. Like there's all these other diseases that are associated with the downstream effects of insulin resistance. The difficulty we have is in many ways people they don't care about it, or it's like those fears are not as salient to them. And so the nice thing we've been able to do is actually balance short term, showing people the feedback loop and how it affects things that matter day to day. So energy levels or weight loss or athletic performance or something like that, while keeping an eye on actually educating people on the long-term impact. Personally, both of my grandfathers had type 2 diabetes, contributed to both of their deaths. And it's something, this is something whenever I see a primary care physician, I have family risk for this, right? And one thing that was incredibly disappointing was diet never really came up. They would run a hemoglobin A1C blood test. Great. I'm not pre-diabetic. And that was it. And I have to wonder if that was basically how my grandfather's experience was, is that things were fine until they weren't fine. And then, it ends up being insulin resistance can run away. And so this is something that we care deeply about, of creating this feedback loop now that's powerful and important and, is tractable for people today, that can also improve long-term stuff. And the only way we're successful is if we're able to bring this mass market. So Sam was talking about that, we start with the premium customer, and, in many ways we have to, because we're building something in a new place. We are advocating for people to take agency in their own metabolic health. We are, leaning strong into personalized medicine, that it's not one size fits all. And the hardware is crazy expensive right now. The nice thing is all of these are solvable. And so as we're able to build our version of the Roadster, it allows us to build our version of the Model S and then the Model 3 and actually take this mass market. And so we love seeing that things like metabolic fitness and those sorts of phrases are starting to be used a lot more, because it means that people are waking up to this this bigger reality about, there is physiological processes that occur over the span of decades that, if you don't have a feedback loop for, you can lose track of.
I really want to do one last science-y question and tell you a story that I promise is true, because I'm sure you've gotten some version of this skepticism from folks. So when I told my co-host of my other podcast, Sagar, that about your company, because I was prepping for the episode, he owns a Whoop. He just bought his Apple Watch. He goes to Equinox. He's literally in your target market. So he went to your website, he saw your marketing. He was super excited about it. He brought this up with his trainer at Equinox, and he swears this is a true story, because this feels a little too constructive for me, but let's just roll with it for an example. He brings it up to his trainer, and then apparently there was a doctor who was working out next to them, and the doctor and the trainer were incredibly skeptical. They said, look, if you are not at risk for diabetes, you do not need to be worrying about your glucose levels. That just is not where the health things are, but it's not where the industry is. So I just want to ask, what is just your response to that right off the face of it, skepticism? And then B, how do you as founders think about skepticism at a meta level when it comes to innovating in new things? Because once again, we're talking kind of in the Elon category. If you're Elon, there's skepticism that you could translate from the first expensive car to a cheaper car. That's been proven now. You're skeptical that you can make orbital space load launches a profitable venture. That's less skeptical now. But I'd love to hear, maybe I'll throw the first one to you then, Sam. So Sam, the question of what's your response to the skepticism? And then Andrew, I'm curious how you just think as a founder about skepticism in spaces that are a little less under-innovated in.
Yeah, I think the short answer is that when you're in the business of category creation, there's going to be a lot of new information for people. A lot of doctors, when we start talking to them about this, are very skeptical of its value. But upon giving more information, almost all are convinced that this is at least an incremental path forward. Dr. Lustig, who's one of our medical advisors, in his latest book, Metabolic, has a section in the book on why measuring glucose doesn't matter. And there is truth to it in as much as it's not a complete metric. Mm-hmm. It is related to why many people feel tired. It does give you insight into the black box. For most people in the US, the problem with their diet is that they eat too much sugar and too many refined carbohydrates. And that's going to show up in glucose. And it's going to really help you see what your diet is doing to your body, but it's not complete. There are false positives. There are false negatives. If you're just measuring glucose with these sensors, a false positive would be really intense exercise. And you'll see a big spike, but that's actually not a bad thing because it's not caused by food that you're eating. It's caused by glycogen getting dumped from your liver to make up for all the glucose that you're burning. And that's totally fine, but you wouldn't really know that unless you have additional metrics that you're tracking. Similarly, there are false negatives. Like it can cause people to think like you can drink a liter of fructose, which is strictly worse for you than glucose, but it's not going to show up because it's not the same type of sugar. So it's actually worse for you. It's entirely processed in your liver. You can almost think of it like alcohol in terms of its contribution to fatty liver disease, in this case, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, but it won't show up because we don't track a metric that gives you that. So it's an incomplete metric, but it is a very helpful metric. And almost all doctors that we've talked to, I think the only ones that we really have not been able to convert after giving them more information are the ones who I think are kind of jaded and have difficulty with people who they've just seen a lot of people who do not take their health seriously and are mostly just convinced like, sure, maybe it's useful, but nobody's ever going to use this. And I think they're largely incorrect on that. We've seen some really inspiring and honestly heartbreaking stories of people where people who have been trying for years to be healthy, they follow all the advice, they eat low fat, they eat whatever the trend is, they're really, really trying. They have oatmeal or pancakes that says heart healthy right on the front because it's whole wheat, right? Whole wheat's good for you. And then they discover through this process that they have real problems. And this is the first time that they've been able to see how these are affecting them. Those heart healthy whole wheat pancakes might not actually be good for you. In fact, they probably aren't. But the way that things like Honey Nut Cheerios are a great example. And a lot of their marketing, like the full bottom third is in red with big hearts all over it on how heart healthy it is. It's really, really bad for you. And they've been able to get away with really misinforming people on a lot of this. So I think that's the biggest thing is that with more information, this is new for people. So it's going to take a lot of education.
Andrew, how about your perspective on all this?
Yeah, and to add to that, to skepticism, I think we can also look at how we're using glucose differently than how it's been used before. If you think about finger pricks or even people managing diabetes with a continuous glucose monitor, their usage of the device is very different. They're attempting to kind of manage their day. They're attempting to dose insulin, these kinds of things. And so I would emphatically agree with them. Someone like me, someone like Sam shouldn't be worried about their glucose, right? And in many ways, like the absolute level doesn't matter as much when someone is otherwise metabolically healthy. But what's interesting is we're able to give people the feedback loop. And so, back to my examples of Cliff Bars, at my previous startup, I would eat 2 a day. I now know the impact of a Cliff Bar is quite high to me, right? And so that's a bad behavior, or a behavior that I should be very cognizant of. And so like, is my like fasting glucose bad? No, like it's fine, but it's incredibly useful that I am able to form this feedback loop where I'm able to see, oh, these are the levers that I have control on, and I can actually be informed now on some trade-offs. Like I can be informed on, the types of sugars I want to eat when I do, and like the difference between different carbs. Like I mentioned earlier that I am sensitive to rice. I am less sensitive to bread. Now, like, doesn't mean that like I should be loading my diet full of just bread, but it does it informs me of the glucose response of this. And so I think that's one of like the key things that differentiates how these devices were previously used, and like how people really thought about metabolic health and like glucose levels and things like that. Because no matter where you're at, you can collect interesting data. You can see like, oh, these behaviors are, particularly good for me or bad for me. One that we ran recently, we internally called the Coke experiment. I had not had a soft drink in probably 10 years. I cut the habit a while ago, and we decided like we would all drink a can of Coke,
full
and
sugar,
then and be stationary. And then we would drink one while going on a light walk. This isn't like a CrossFit exercise or a run or anything like this. This is, let's just have some physical activity to provide a place for that glucose to go. And there's a blog post up on our blog of the results of this, and it's pretty mind blowing. Like wow, you can have some pretty awful food and pair it with physical activity, and the outcome's better. And so in many ways, like I would confront the skepticism with just stories from our customers of, like understanding these levers and like how it impacts their day-to-day life, whether it was, struggle losing weight, or, energy levels throughout the day, or, anything like that, even like sleep health. Like there was a recent customer that wrote a really great blog post about, he recognized that whenever his Oura ring was signaling that he's waking up in the night, and he noticed that it corresponds to low glucose in the middle of the night. That's interesting. And he was able to debug it. He's like, oh, it was a combination of food and supplements at a certain time was causing these glucose oscillations as he slept. Is that being worried about glucose? Not really. Like it's really being informed about how your body's working. And so like that's kind of how I see it. In general, like you had asked about like how do we view skepticism in general on a lot of these industries that have minimal innovation, or at least very strong incumbent forces. I think like that is a problem across startups. Is startups can be overconfident in how they're revolutionizing the world and how they're changing things. And it's something that we have to stay incredibly humble about. We have to stay tied to the science, working very closely with our medical advisors and hearing from customers and that sort of thing, that we have to be humble about, how what we're doing is impacting people and the claims we can make and things like that. I think that's entirely true. I think like a healthy dose of skepticism is good. In many ways, it sharpens us even more. Like it makes us hone our message. It makes us hone our product, and like where is the most value we can get from customers, and like what are the form of personalized insights that are most meaningful to people. And so I would say like in many ways, like the skepticism is welcome, because it's, the outcome I think everyone wants is to reverse the metabolic health crisis. we're confident that we can make a dent into it, if not a lot more. But it's something that, we need to be challenged by, and we need to understand non-biohacker, non-technically savvy kind of people, because that's where a lot of our market will be.
And actually, to that point, one quick thing that one of the things that Andrew said is that it's being used in a very different way than it has historically. Specifically, a lot of the doctors that I talk to, when they hear glucose monitoring, they automatically assume insulin. And they hear, in fact, some of them, when you say glucose monitoring, they hear insulin pump. And so when we say, yeah, we're having people track the glucose with a glucose monitor, they hear we're putting insulin pumps on healthy people and injecting them with insulin. And it's not what we're doing. So a lot of that's just overcoming that initial hurdle and explaining, we're just measuring, we're showing them how their diet affects them. Nobody is taking insulin. That solves for a lot of it. So a big piece of this is just, this is new. This is technology that people are familiar with in a very different context. So it's why we put so much effort into content. You've probably looked over our blog. There's a lot of content there. We know that there's a really big education burden, so we put a lot of effort into that.
I'm realizing, especially going down your memo, which we'll link in the show notes, of course, recategorizing the premium version of your product as being adjacent to 8 Sleep or a Fitbit or a Whoop device, in that it's designed to give you metrics. And, from my personal example, I work out harder when my Apple Watch is going and it's tracking my beats per minute. So I think that's just a useful way of understanding the framework at this level. But I want to pivot to the broader stakes here, because this is where I think this really translates from, hey, this is fun, we all want to biohack and be vibey, to there's actually a broader problem that you're focused on, which is, you referred to this, the metabolic health crisis. Andrew, can you all, I'll throw this to you, and Andrew, can you define what that crisis is? Because in the memo, it specifically states that we will consider the metabolic health crisis in the terms that we consider cancer and the opioid epidemic 5 years from now. So anyone who is either not in the United States or hasn't followed that issue, we're talking cataclysmic scales of terrible, fatal health outcomes. So we'd just love for you to explain your definition and the actual crisis.
Yeah, so I mentioned that metabolic health corresponds to many diseases. And I think the one people are most familiar with is type 2 diabetes, which is, it is basically insulin resistance because of you being exposed to a very high insulin background. And so having very high glucose, more insulin load, and over time, you just get less sensitive to it. From memory, I think it was 88 million US adults over the age of 18 have pre-diabetes currently. And the scary thing is, statistically, most of them will become diabetic in their life. So this is right now a one-way flow of people go from metabolically normal in a clinical sense to pre-diabetic to diabetic. And in many ways, diabetes is not treated, it's managed. There are organizations that are trying to, like, with very large diet interventions to reverse type 2, and some of them have been successful. But if we look clinically how diabetes is actually managed, it's largely just managing the disease, whether it's dosing insulin, it's keeping track of things. The impact of diabetes is very significant. And it's when I mentioned my grandfathers, it contributed to both of their deaths. That's often how it happens, where it's a contribution. Amputations for diabetics are very common. People lose sensation in their feet, and an infection happens, and then it's not taken care of fast enough because you don't feel it. My wife's grandmother currently is diabetic, and I looked at the material she has, and it was very sad. Like it was not they did not strongly push for diet interventions and things like that. She is currently losing her eyesight. And so like the way diabetes affects people is very strong, but I don't want to limit it to just diabetes. Heart disease is in the spectrum of insulin resistance. There's a lot of evidence that different kinds of cancers grow faster in high glucose environments. If you think about, like, cancers are cells that are growing uncontrolled. Well, providing a lot of fuel for that can't be good. And so we've actually seen studies where people go on very strict ketogenic diets to try to slow down the cancer's growth. It's inconclusive, doesn't apply to all cancers, but this is also in the realm. So like we look at these diseases that are often associated with old age, and we look like what's happening in the decades prior. Like what are the things that are leading to them? And we see a very stark like outcome. Dr. Lustig, who Sam alluded to in his book, by some metrics, 88% of US adults are insulin resistant in some way. That's terrifying. Like what have we done wrong? Like how have we messed up our food system and things like that? And so one of the things that's most exciting for me with this feedback loop is actually creating some accountability for food, where, brands can't as easily talk about how, heart healthy they are, when at the same time, like we know that, diets that are composed of these very simple sugars that are very easily metabolized and cause very high glucose environments, thus high insulin, they're not good for you. And so I think like that's the space of the metabolic health crisis that is important to us. There's many outcomes of this. I think like easy one for us to track is what is the diabetes and pre-diabetes incidence rate in America. And if we're successful, that starts going down. Right now it's climbing very quickly. And so, but there's many other, there's other things that we could observe if we're successful in reversing this trend.
Yeah, and actually to the point, the reason why there's always there seems to be semantic escalation in today's news environment about everything being a crisis. But I think people really do not understand the scope of how serious this problem is. Diabetes as one metric for this, it's more than 10% of the US population right now, and it's increasing at an increasing rate. It's accelerating. The second derivative is positive, not the first derivative. There are, alluding to something Andrew mentioned before, about they didn't used to think that skinny people could get diabetes. Well, they didn't think children could get it either. They used to call it adult onset diabetes. There was juvenile, which is type 1, and adult onset. And then like 6-year-olds and 7-year-olds are getting adult onset. Like, what the hell is this? We have to come up with a new name for it. Now we'll call it type 1 and type 2, because clearly this is not an adult thing. There's also fatty liver disease, which used to be caused by alcohol. Alcoholics get fatty liver disease. And then they're like, well, 5-year-olds are getting fatty liver disease now. Like, they're not drinking alcohol. So what's causing this? They're like, well, we need a new category now, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. Which is basically caused by processed foods and sugar. Dr. Lustig, he's proposed calling this processed food disorder, which probably won't catch on, but one can hope.
Our doctors are not our marketers, so we have to put people in their specific boxes. Something I'm really struggling with, especially with the opioid crisis example, is who is to blame for the current state of affairs? Because within the opioid crisis example, you see a system where the FDA and overprescribing doctors and bad economic incentives combined with really negligent companies led to this horrific crisis that led to just a horrific number of deaths. With this, though, the word blame feels to be somewhat misplaced. So once again, like within the metaphor, how should we consider the system? But at the same time, to follow up on this real quick, you had a food pyramid, which was horrifically designed to give people all this bad. So how did the two of you just think of the idea of responsibility and blame and the system that folks' individual choices are playing into?
Yeah, I think the short answer is that we didn't know. I don't think the low-fat movement was malicious. I think it's had very negative health consequences for a lot of people, but I don't think it was malicious. It's another thing that Andrew mentioned before is how diabetes is not treated, it's managed. I think that these things just take a long time. Most people I talk to, when you talk about things like reversing diabetes, which is pretty well understood at this point in the scientific literature, Virta is probably the best company in the space. People say that's ridiculous. You can't reverse diabetes. It's a chronic condition. Some people just don't believe you that it's possible. And others just say like, yeah, okay, maybe some people, but nobody will adhere to that and it doesn't work. And they just generally have skepticism around, I guess, the human condition. And they think really poorly of people in general, which just philosophically, we don't share that worldview. So I think that
quick follow-up? What is your worldview then?
I think that most people want to be healthy and they want to live positive and productive lives. I think that one of the biggest reasons why they don't is that there's bad information. People don't know, like, one of the pieces of pushback I've heard is like, everyone knows Doritos are bad for you. It's like, yes, everyone kind of implicitly knows that. I actually had a friend who, when he started using Levels, he used to drink 4 or 5 cans of soda every day. And he was telling me afterwards, it's like, yeah, my mom always tells me, like, don't drink soda, it's bad for you. It's like, yeah, okay, whatever. He started wearing a glucose monitor. He started seeing numbers that you're not supposed to see as a healthy person. And he noticed that he would have this huge spike from the sugar in the soda, followed by a crash. And he would like basically almost pass out. He was so low energy and he was craving sugar. And so he'd have his next soda and it was just this death spiral. And he realized, like, one, the soda is the cause of these problems. And two, I'm maybe not invincible. Like I'm seeing, I thought I was a healthy person. The numbers that I'm seeing are really concerning. And so he hasn't had soda since then. And so you can sort of know in the back of your mind. It's sort of like sometimes people know, it's like, yeah, I know that alcohol is bad for my sleep. Like I've heard that before, but I can tell you for myself, it wasn't until I wore an Oura ring and I saw just how much it impacted my sleep that I said, all right, I'm gonna not do that anymore. I don't think it's worth it.
Something I'm super curious about, given what you just said, especially knock on wood, as this first premium product is a success and you move down the income ladder when it comes to accessibility for your products. To what degree do you feel people will be able to take actions based on what you're describing? So I'm just thinking of the most conventional wisdom, most obvious responses of, okay, so let's say people now explicitly know that your glucose spikes. How do, let's say, food deserts play into this? How does, okay, processed food is bad. I think everyone explicitly kind of gets that processed food is bad, but it's also cheaper. So therefore, people have, I think everyone would buy organic food if they could, but there's a reason why people don't just do that. So I'm obviously not saying it's y'all's responsibility to solve a broader like systemic food distribution issue, but how do you just think about the helping people or people's ability to make adjustments? Because like, once again, Sam, what I really appreciate there is your really optimistic take on human nature. So let's just buy your premise of like, let's be optimistic about people's desire to. What are people's abilities? I'll throw that you to first, Andrew, as you're thinking about the thing that causes this not to scale up part.
I think that is a entirely reasonable thing for us to be thinking about long term, and for us to think about in terms of access, because I think, like as you alluded to, a lot of the metabolic health crisis is happening not on people that are biohackers and that are buying every wearable and things like that. So I think like the first side of this is access, them able to get the information as easily as possible. I think there's also like a widespread distrust of the medical system, particularly when we talk about personalized health. When you have a model of one size fits all and it doesn't fit, it's very easy to have a jaded perspective of like, this isn't for me. And so one of the nice things is everyone can kind of experience things for themselves. Pragmatically, I kind of think about it working backwards. Like, what if the idea of processed food being like infinite calories, cheaply available at any time, and this sort of thing, what if that's a bad idea, right? Like, what if just like fundamentally we have to get away from that? How do we work backwards and like, increase access? And it's awareness, right? Because like, you're right, it is way cheaper. Like, food that doesn't spoil is way easier to transport. It's way easier to market. Like, if you look at what foods get advertisement, big broccoli is not running advertisements for you eating, a pound of broccoli. But interestingly, you'll see these like health halo products that do, right? And so in many ways, like, if we need to get back to minimally processed food, people's awareness has to come first. Like, you have to be aware, what is the impact? It will totally take time. But like, we've seen this in many other ways, like when there is interest, like the market can meet that. And right now there's like this there's this misinformation mismatch between, how food affects people and what their interests are, living long, living healthy, being able to be functional in life, and like not feeling like you're always on an energy roller coaster. Because there's this like impedance mismatch, it's really hard for people to, like point their finger and put blame at any one thing. Because you're right, like I find it problematic to point to any individual organization, like even like large food conglomerates. They're kind of optimizing in the system they have. So in many ways, we have to change the system. I see that as an awareness problem. Is people demanding for foods that are healthier for them, and foods that have better metabolic outcomes and support more holistic health. This is something that'll take a long time, but it's something I'm also really optimistic about.
Something I'm very curious about. This is a really strong news you can use episode. How do the two of you think about fad diets? And I want to say fad diet because that is a bit of a value judgment. But as you've alluded to, past 40 years of our broader lifetimes, there's just been a cycle versus cycle versus cycle. How do you just, at an intellectual level, like what do we, can you actually, let's just do this. What do we know about health? Like, I'm a 29-year-old man. I exercise 3 to 5 times a week. What should I be eating? Because the advice I'm getting is different than the advice I would have been getting in the 1980s.
Yeah, it's funny. We're actually in the process of writing the Levels dietary philosophy to try to help people understand this. And I had a long conversation with my cousin Matt about a week ago, where he basically asked the same question. He's like, "Is organic? Does that actually matter?" Like, my wife is saying not to eat blueberries anymore because
I heard
they
that
have pesticides or something. Like, they're bad. Blueberries are bad for you now. I don't know what's going on. And I think the part of the challenge is there's a lot of moralizing related to diet, like things that are good, things that are bad. The reality is that life is all about trade-offs, and there are things that are better and there are things that are fine. And I would say Michael Pollan's advice of eat whole foods, not too much, mostly plants. You're probably safe. I would say if you avoid refined sugar and you avoid processed foods for the most part, you don't have to be fully abstinent. Like, I will sometimes have dessert, and that's fine.
Very edgy. The way you said it, you're like, I will sometimes do a bump of chocolate cake,
Exactly. Yeah. So if you avoid sugar, refined sugar, if you don't eat too many processed foods, and you eat mostly whole foods, you're like 95% of the way there. And like all the stuff about like, well, is it organic? Is it grass-fed? Like, grass-fed is better. But if the alternative is processed foods, doing like grass-fed beef or eat the non-grass-fed beef. It's like, well, but beef might have these implications around like marginally increased risk of cancer. It's like, okay, but relative to what? If the baseline is the standard American diet, like get off of that immediately. That like if you're eating TV dinners and you're eating the standard American diet, get off of that as fast as possible and switch to eating whole foods. And what's interesting is actually something you mentioned about processed foods being cheaper. I think this is in Dr. Hyman's work, maybe in his book Food Fix. It's actually not that different. It's not eating vegetables, eating whole foods is not that different in terms of cost. It's really just a question of how palatable these are. These foods like Doritos are made to be hyper palatable. They taste for like a taste per dollar, maybe they're much cheaper. But in terms of calories or nutrition per dollar, it's not that different. It's probably plus or minus 10%.
That brings to mind a question, though, especially eating Doritos is not the hip thing to do in our circles. So I don't really know any people with Dorito problems. So for the population that is struggling with that issue, are people thinking about nutrition? I don't want that to sound condescending because I personally, as I'm reaching my 30s, I've started to experience like the early effects of aging, but I was just not thinking of nutrition until very recently. So let's just expand it. Like, how much are you actually finding people thinking along the lines of nutrition? Because when I would think about how I ate unhealthily in college, my metric wasn't dollar per nutritional benefit. It was dollar per, hey, ramen's like really quick. How do people actually think about nutrition up until the point where they actually have the onset of really terrible health effects? Andrew, you could take that.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I think everyone has their own journey, and whether it's, what's happening in their family, what, things that they've experienced. There are a lot of people that are very diet centric, and like naturally adhere to, prescriptive protocols. Other people hear like Michael Pollan's advice and they're like, hey, that's for me. Like, that's something I can stick to. That's something that isn't heavily moralized. Many people aren't aware, right? And I think like early on that can't be our market. I mean, like to take the Tesla analogy forward, early Tesla customers, they saw the promise of electric vehicles and trying to take someone who likes their Ford F-150, like it's just early on, it doesn't work. But we're seeing like the latest Ford F-150 is electric, right? They have an electric model that will sell well. And so I think it takes time. It's something that everyone has their own journey. Like I think particularly when something is salient to someone, they care. So like when they're feeling like they're on the energy roller coaster, or they have a family member that, had a shocking health discovery or something like that, I think like that's when people are really receptive. And, we see a lot of customers that are older than us three that, are recognizing the effects of aging. And they're like, okay, I want to do what I can. Right. And in many ways, earlier is better. But, if you haven't cared about it, today is perfectly great as well. To also build on your question about diets, it's interesting. Our chief medical officer, Dr. Casey Means, is almost exclusively plant-based. And so you would, imagine like that's the diet she's advocating for everyone. And the answer is not really. Like there's many diets that work for different people. And so, I think like the best diet is one that's sustainable, that looks different than the standard American diet, that, incorporates whole foods. But whether that's a keto diet on grass-fed beef and all these things, or it's a largely plant-based diet, getting almost all of your protein from like beans and things like that, we're seeing good health outcomes in both of these. And so like naively, you would think that they're polar opposites. And if you read diet books, you would think that like that there's no possible way that someone's blood work could be really good, on a plant-based diet or on a keto diet. But yet we see that. And so I think in many ways, it's increasing awareness, creating the feedback loop. And we don't have any suggested levels diet. We don't have a meal plan we're offering people or anything like that. In many ways, like we want people to meet us where they are and whatever is most sustainable to them. My dad was eating a bagel for breakfast that was causing a large glucose spike, and just bringing awareness of that, I think, is really powerful. He might still do that some, and I think like strict diets in general weren't incredibly compatible with how he saw nutrition, but when he understands the impact of things, okay, now I can make like decisions, on the margin that can actually greatly impact kind of the trajectory I'm heading in.
I'm glad you brought up the lack of meal plans, because it's a good pivot into our last section here with your name, rank, serial number, founder questions. Are you gonna create a meal plan? Like, what's the long-term vision here? Like, maybe this is crazy, I don't know the unit economics for y'all's industry, but I could easily see a world where it's like, hey, Marshall, like I buy a variety of like meal prep products. I've tried a bunch during COVID, quarantine, have stuck with it. It's really great, especially if you're working and busy. I would love to be able to send in something that felt customized for me based on like my metrics and my data. So how do you just think about you don't have to even respond to my quick example there / pitch, but how do you think of the long-term vision for what you all are trying to build?
Yeah, we've talked to some companies that do that. We certainly looked into it. It's a tough business. Mm-hmm. So staying as firmly in software as possible.
Logistics really, and delivery of perishable food items is probably not the next step.
Exactly.
But what about the broader perspective?
There's something powerful about accountability with food. And we've had several brands reach out to us that are like, hey, we know that we are we can support a good metabolic health, and we don't have large glucose impacts. Do you have like a level certified thing? And so there's a lot of options here in the future where as long as we make it as easy as possible for consumers to kind of like navigate, find the right foods for them, that's good for us. We don't feel that glucose is the end all be all. It's a really nice slice into metabolic health, which is a slice into overall health. And so to not overstate how we see glucose, it's somewhere that was basically begging for innovation, like begging for someone to use this data to create the feedback loops for people. It's also not our endpoint. And so I think we recognize the long-term potential of personalized health and building feedback loops and this sort of thing to support people to be healthy in general, more than just, managing their glucose, more than just metabolic health.
Speaking of the opportunity you all saw, what's the quick 30-second version of your origin story? How did you get into this industry? Just interested in it. How did you two meet? Like, what did that side of the journey look like?
I don't know about 30 seconds. Josh,
40. You get 45. I give you 15.
Josh did a really good series of podcasts on the origin story on A Whole New Level, which is it's actually our internal company podcast that we publish externally. But we could probably talk about how Andrew and I met. We met at the first On Deck founder retreat, and I remember vividly bumping into Andrew in the hallway, and then we started talking, and then the sun went down, and 3 hours later, we were still standing in the same place talking. and
I think it wasn't, I know for a fact it wasn't anything related to glucose. I think it was something about
that'd be crazy. I think that'd be, you're like, he was eating a bagel and I smacked it out of his hand, and then we kept, Yeah, that's no. I think that's helpful. But how did it translate into glue? Is it just you meet someone and then relationships evolve over time, and then a mutual interest develops, and that bit?
Yeah, the interesting thing was, we're a fully remote company and have been from the beginning. So I was living in the San Francisco Bay Area. Sam was living in New York. We met up again. Like, Sam travels a lot, for anyone who knows him, and we met up again when he was visiting the Bay Area. And it's, a priori, it seems pretty implausible that you'd be able to start a company with random people over the US. When we started, we all convened on a house in Los Angeles for a few days to work together, kind of like, is this something that can happen? How do we like working with each other? That sort of thing. And so from my perspective, it was a great experience to really, be able to work very closely with Sam and the other co-founders with a like take it or leave it, where like if it doesn't work out, cool. Like I'm gamefully employed. But it was very clear to me then that the future here is something that like I have to be involved in. I personally have been interested in wellness and health for a lot of my adult life. Had tried to get continuous glucose monitors based on reading like biohacker books and stuff like that, and was declined. And so like this was like a oh duh kind of thing when Sam started talking to it. And I think the phrase if I'm remembering it right, it was like, I'm definitely investing, but I think I might quit my job for this. And so it was something that I want to work on something that's meaningful. And I think like startups throw that around. I can't think of too much more meaningful of like helping people change the health trajectory of their life, at least for me. And so that's something that like I wanted to work on. And so, yeah.
I think that's a really great place to leave things, except for this one last question. So from the two of you, what is the immediate next step for the business from the sides you are focusing on? So let's start with you, Sam.
Yeah. Building out the team. If you know any good engineers, send them our way.
I don't know a single one.
Classic pitch.
That's for the audience. Company. Pay attention.
Building out the team. We put a lot of effort into making sure we really are building the all-star team solving this problem. A big part of it is also more tactically is thinking a lot more about business model and long-term incentive alignment, something that we think a lot about. We're going to be putting a pretty big effort into that over the course of the next few months. We're hopefully going to open up the beta program by the end of the year. It's not really timeline based, it's more milestones. We have a number of important things that we need to solve. The chronology is somewhat arbitrary. I think we have something like 60 months of runway right now. So we're not in a hurry to launch, but we would like to do it as soon as possible because really we want to solve this problem as soon as possible.
Yeah, to add to that, one thing that was surprising to me as we started getting customers onto Levels before Levels had an app or anything like that is that it was very clear to us that the hardware is not enough, that just access to glucose monitoring really keeps it in the realm of how glucose is currently treated and doesn't really open things up to personalized insights and deep understanding of how things impact you. So we're spending a lot of time on that, is like, how can we most effectively convey information to people that is specialized to them, that is scoped to their situation, whether it's what they're trying to optimize or how their glucose is responding to meals and things like that. We see this huge space on top of just the sensors that closes this feedback loop. That without it, it's like it as if a lot of people are into heart rate variability, and the most common thing of like, what's normal? What do I do? And then the same thing happens for glucose. Is like you get your glucose, like, okay, now what? And like we've been focusing a lot on the now what. Like, how can I make these insights meaningful to me and like close these feedback loops? And so it takes time. Building in a new space takes a lot of product iteration. It takes a lot of failing. And so this is where we're focused on now as we support our existing beta program. And we're excited to continue to open it up to more people.
That's awesome. So any suggestions for where folks should look next, especially since you shouted out the huge amount of blog content, and I'm not kidding, did the research for the show. There's actually literally too much to read. So how about the two of you just shout out, beyond just the secret memo, which is a good place to start, what is the number one piece you two would recommend, or pieces that you'd recommend folks go to next?
I think for this particular audience, listening to our podcast, A Whole New Level, is a good place to start, just because it really does give an inside look, a really honest take on the founding of the company, who the people are at the company. Josh and I did a podcast on co-founder dynamics, where Josh had a really open and vulnerable conversation about some of the most difficult times in our co-founder dynamic. So that's probably a really good place to start. I'm hoping that it really becomes a resource. One of my goals in life is to get more people to start companies. I think that too many people go the easy path of finance or law. And I think that when people see how, like, we're not superheroes. If you look at our website and you go to the bottom, there's an inside the company link. You can see our first investor update. You can see all of our company all hands that we record. You can see what our company was like when we were 6 people. I think that's probably the place that I would refer people.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and obviously, I think our whole blog is wonderful. We have been incredibly fortunate to get the right people involved in writing some truly wonderful content. This is a lot of startups that their content strategy is about like SEO optimization. Ours was writing the pieces that we wish existed before Levels. And so I would recommend people go to Levels blog. If anyone wants to read more deeply into the state of metabolic health and the food system, a book that Sam alluded to before, Metabolical by Dr. Robert Lustig, is a very good book. And so even though I'd love to keep your audience, that is, go there if you really want to learn about, how body processes food, how the processed food industry has interacted with medicine and these sorts of things. He is an incredibly intelligent individual that has been incredibly helpful steering us as we think about, the food system and metabolic health.
That is the perfect place to leave it. Sam, Andrew, thank you so much for joining us in the deep end.
Yeah, of course.